So for me, the Cold War was very real, and but I came up in a world where the Democrats were not really the worst of the actual sympathy towards the Soviet Union was past.
Hmm.
That was really a relic of the 60s and 70s. Instead, what you had was the Democrats were just weak on foreign policy, right? It wasn't that they were sympathetic to the Soviets, but that Carter himself actually became much tougher on the Soviets after year two of his administration.
He did.
Um, but that they were just generally weak on foreign policy, and they weren't interested in expanding freedom and countering the Soviets in hard ways. And I found that attractive because I believe in liberalism, and I you know the Republican Party and conservatism itself. Maybe I should say more conservatism itself. Conservatism itself was at least superficially invested in liberalism. And I think that is objectively no longer true. For me, I mean, the academic question is always, were they ever invested in liberalism, or was that just a convenient argument for what they wanted at the moment? Yeah, and I don't have the answer for that. Uh, but what we see now is, Bill and I talked about this last week about the what happens when you have both rotten people and rotten elites. A culture can survive rotten people, and a culture can survive rotten elites. Whether it can survive having both at the same time is I think anybody's guess. And we have voters who are stupid and who, to the extent that they are not stupid, want bad things. They want anti-democratic things. They want minority rule. Not all the voters, but a good 40% of them. That's a lot. And you also then have elites who no longer are moored towards anything other than power for the sake of power. And that leads you to a very dark place. And that is what conservatism is now. There is no, and again, my I when people because people ask me this all the time, and my response is, I am conservative in disposition, meaning that I just believe that everything good we have in the world is tenuous. Everything is much more delicate than we imagine it to be. And if we monkey with anything, it is very possible that we'll make it worse. In fact, maybe even likely that we'll make it worse, which is sort of, I think, a classic conservative view of life. But what the people who that is no longer what conservatism means. Conservatism now means nothing but the seizing of power for the sake of power. And if that requires creating novel legal interpretations of existing law, uh, for instance, surrounding the Electoral Count Act, then conservatism is perfectly happy to do it. And this is, I just don't know that it's survivable. There is a sense of, oh, well, there's a crisis looming out there on the horizon. 2024 could be a crisis. And I just reject that. The crisis is now. We are in the middle of a crisis. It is an ongoing crisis of the regime. And whether or not we will all get out of this intact, I think, is a very open question.